From the beginning, Solomon's life was far from ordinary or easy. He was born at a delicate time, marked by pain and shame. His father, King David, had had an affair with Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, a faithful soldier who died tragically in war, after a dark plan devised by David to cover up his adultery. This story was circulated among the people, a painful secret that left invisible marks on the hearts of all involved. The couple's first child did not survive, and the punishment seemed to hang in the air like a weight on the family's destiny. Even so, in the reconciliation that came later, Bathsheba conceived again, and from there Solomon was born, a boy whose name already carried a strong meaning, peace, as if life had offered him a second chance. On the day Solomon came into the world, no one could have imagined the impact that child would have on the future of Israel. He arrived surrounded by suspicious looks, some full of judgment, others with timid hope. David, the powerful king, carried the guilt and responsibility of his actions, but also the determination to rebuild what had been broken. Bathsheba, with all the silent strength of a woman who had experienced suffering, kept in her eyes the faith that this boy would be different, that he could bring peace where before there had only been pain. It was as if his very name were a promise that would have to be fulfilled, even in the shadow of past mistakes. The situation around Solomon, however, was not easy. The court was full of intrigue and whispers, and the fact that he was the product of a relationship considered scandalous made him a target. But on that particular day, the day he was born and introduced to the world, there was an unexpected calm, as if something greater was at work. Solomon was not just a child. He was living proof that God could transform the most difficult situations into hope and redemption. That moment marked the beginning of a journey that, although surrounded by challenges, carried within itself the potential to change the entire history of a people. Solomon was not David's eldest son, and in those times the right to inherit the throne was clear. The firstborn took over. But Solomon's life was already beginning to show that he would not follow common rules. Behind his rise to power was the prophet Nathan, a respected and feared figure who saw a special destiny in the young man. Nathan used his influence to convince David that Solomon was God's chosen heir, not only because he was his son, but because he carried a divine mission. This game of trust and strategy was decisive in ensuring that the throne would not go to someone else, especially when rivals tried to get closer to take what seemed to be theirs by right. On the day the decision was confirmed, there was a mixture of tension and expectation in the palace. Many doubted, while others watched every move of the king and the prophet closely. David, already old and weak, trusted Nathan's advice, believing that this was God's will, even if the decision would generate disputes. Solomon, for his part, did not appear arrogant. He seemed to understand that this opportunity came with an enormous weight, and that he would have to prove his worth at every step. The atmosphere was one of uncertainty, but also of hope for those who saw beyond lineage and saw the future of Israel. Solomon's rise to the throne was not just a matter of blood, but of faith and strategy. The prophet Nathan was crucial, acting as a link between the divine and the human, guiding and paving the way. Solomon, still young, received not only the title of king, but the mission of honoring a greater promise. That moment revealed that what is traditional does not always prevail. Sometimes God acts unexpectedly, using men and women to change course. This is how Solomon began to write his story, not only as the son of King David, but as a chosen one who would transform Israel forever. Taking the throne at such a young age was no easy task for Solomon. Early in his reign, he faced powerful enemies within his own court, men who were unwilling to give up power. Joab, the commander of the army, and Adonijah, his half-brother, were figures who represented real threats to his rule. Solomon, despite his youth, did not hesitate to act decisively to eliminate these opponents. He knew that the survival of the kingdom depended on solid leadership without internal divisions, and that any hesitation could cost everything that his father and he had achieved. On that fateful day, when Solomon ordered the execution of Joab and Adonijah, the atmosphere in the palace was tense, filled with fear and anticipation. The young ruler was showing that governing required more than wisdom. It required courage and pragmatism. The court watched in silence, aware that the rise of a new king also required the elimination of hidden dangers. Solomon was not there to be a passive monarch. He was already showing signs of a leader willing to do whatever it took to protect his people and his legacy. This initial purge was a pivotal moment for Solomon. It cemented his power and made it clear to all that, though young, he would not be underestimated. It was a difficult but necessary step that revealed his character and determination to maintain the unity of the kingdom. Solomon knew that his reign would not be marked solely by wealth or wisdom, but also by steadfastness in defending what had been entrusted to him. From that day on, the young king's trajectory began to take shape, a ruler who, despite adversity, was ready to lead Israel into a new era. That night, after Solomon had assumed the throne and faced his initial challenges, he had a dream that would forever change the way he would rule. God appeared, offering him any wish, anything he wanted to ask for. And even though he had the option of asking for riches, power, or a long life, Solomon made an unexpected request: wisdom to lead his people justly. It was not a request of vanity or selfishness, but of humility, an acknowledgement that the weight of the crown required more than strength. It required understanding and discernment. The impact of this dream was not felt only by Solomon. When he woke up, the people around him began to notice a difference. The young king, who until then had shown himself to be firm in his power, now carried a serenity and depth that impressed everyone. God recognized this humility, and as a reward, not only granted him the wisdom he requested, but also gave him riches and fame that would surpass any other king. It was a moment when heaven and earth seemed to align, confirming that this reign would be special. From that day on, Solomon's fame spread throughout the region. The people of Israel felt that they were in the presence of a different ruler, one who truly sought to do what was right. The request for wisdom was not just a personal decision, but the beginning of a legacy that would be remembered for generations. Solomon became a living example that even when faced with the greatest opportunities, the most powerful choice is the one that puts the collective good above one's own interests. Shortly after consolidating his authority, Solomon faced an unexpected challenge that would demonstrate his wisdom in a practical and direct way. Two women came to him, each claiming to be the mother of the same baby, and their dispute seemed impossible to resolve with mere words. The tension was palpable in the room as the young king calmly assessed the situation, aware that his decision would not only define the fate of this child, but also reveal his true ability to rule. Everyone expected a solution, but no one imagined what would come next. Solomon proposed to divide the baby in half, offering half to each woman. It was a shocking request, which caused the real mother to reveal herself instantly, begging for the child to be spared and given to the other woman, even if she herself would lose the child. The other woman, on the other hand, accepted the proposal, making it clear that her interest was not genuine. This dramatic moment not only revealed the truth, but also showed that Solomon did not need complicated evidence or witnesses to judge wisely. He had a gaze that penetrated people's hearts. The story of the trial of the two mothers quickly spread and came to be seen as the ultimate proof of Solomon's wisdom. On that day, faced with a difficult decision, he demonstrated that true leadership requires more than knowledge. It requires sensitivity to understand the human essence. This episode became known as a symbol of justice and discernment, consolidating Solomon as a ruler who could resolve even the most complex conflicts, always with a vision that went beyond what the eyes could see. Soon after establishing his reign and demonstrating his wisdom, Solomon began one of the greatest works of his life, the construction of the Temple of God in Jerusalem. He knew that this temple would be the ultimate symbol of the faith and unity of the people of Israel, a place where God could dwell among them. To this end, Solomon made an alliance with Hiram, king of Tyre, an important agreement that guaranteed the timber, gold, and skilled craftsmen needed for the construction. The work would be gigantic, requiring many years of planning and dedication, but it reflected Solomon's vision for his people. During the 7 years of construction, the temple dominated the lives of Jerusalem. All eyes were on this project that seemed more like a grand dream than a possible reality. Solomon oversaw every detail, demanding perfection and imposing discipline, but also inspiring his workers with a greater purpose. The temple was not just a building of stone and wood, it was the living promise of a people seeking God's presence in the midst of their battles and conquests. Each stone laid carried a spiritual weight that everyone felt. When the temple was finally completed, the entire city celebrated with joy and reverence. Solomon, faced with this monumental work, knew that he had accomplished a mission that would forever mark the history of Israel. The temple became a spiritual center that united nations and reinforced the identity of the chosen people. For Solomon, this achievement was more than a symbol of power. It was the materialization of faith and commitment to God, a heritage that he knew would withstand the test of time and the storms of life. After completing the temple, Solomon turned his attention to building his own palace, a project that took longer than the temple itself, about 13 years. He knew he needed a space worthy of his position, a place that would reflect the power and grandeur of the kingdom he ruled. The palace was not just a place to live, but a visible symbol of the stability and prestige Solomon had earned since his early days on the throne. During those years, Jerusalem changed its appearance significantly. The palace was enormous, with spacious halls, lush gardens, and luxurious details that impressed everyone who passed by. Solomon supervised the work carefully, knowing that every stone and ornament had to express the success of the kingdom. At the same time, his court grew in influence and wealth, attracting visitors from far away who came to witness the splendor of the Israelite capital. The construction of the palace also showed Solomon's human side. Behind the powerful king was someone who understood the importance of representation and legacy. He knew that this space would be remembered as the home of a king who took Israel to a new level. The palace reinforced not only his political power, but also the idea of a united, prosperous, and secure kingdom. It was the stage where important decisions would be made and where the story of a great reign would continue to be written. Solomon's fame spread far and wide, and it wasn't long before an unexpected visitor arrived in Jerusalem, the Queen of Sheba. Curious and intrigued by the stories of the young king's wisdom and wealth, she came in person to test his intelligence and meet the man who everyone said was different from other rulers. The visit had an undertone of challenge, but also of silent admiration, for she herself knew that it would not be easy to impress someone with her already established fame. During her stay, the queen observed every detail, the layout of the palace, the way Solomon answered her, difficult questions, and the wealth visible in every corner. She was surprised not only by the magnitude of the kingdom, but by the depth of the king's knowledge, which seemed to see beyond the obvious. For her, the stories told before the trip were just the tip of the iceberg. What she found in Jerusalem exceeded all expectations, making it clear that Solomon's power really came from the wisdom that God had given him. At the end of her visit, the Queen of Sheba left Jerusalem with a feeling of mixed respect and fascination. She returned to her country with reports that would further increase the fame of the king and his kingdom, confirming that Solomon was not only a man of wealth, but a true sage who ruled with justice and vision. This historic visit reinforced Solomon's position in the world, showing that his wisdom was recognized and admired far beyond the borders of Israel. As the years passed, Solomon was no longer remembered solely for his righteousness or wealth. His name became synonymous with wisdom, and his influence extended beyond politics and architecture. He wrote thousands of proverbs, composed songs, and composed texts that would span generations. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon were not just poetic works. They were records of a mind that understood the complexities of life, love, suffering, and faith. Israel was now not just a military or economic powerhouse, but also an intellectual and spiritual center. Kings of other nations sent emissaries to seek advice. People traveled for weeks just to hear a word from him. It was as if Solomon's wisdom satisfied a thirst that the whole world felt but few could quench. And it was not just superficial wisdom. He spoke about behavior, justice, humility, life and death, with a clarity that touched even the most skeptical. He knew how to observe human beings. He knew how to speak to ordinary people and great heads of state with the same firmness and empathy. During this period of his reign, Solomon lived at the height of his glory. Israel was at peace, its borders were secure, and its granaries were full. The combination of stability, art, and spirituality made this period one of the most prosperous in the history of the Hebrew people. But even with all this, signs of spiritual distraction began to emerge. Solomon, so focused in his early years, began to divide himself between his commitment to God and the attractions of power. Even so, his literary production made it clear that he knew, even if unconsciously, that all of this only made sense if God remained at the center. Over time, the wisdom that had elevated Solomon began to fade under the weight of his poor choices. The king, who had once dedicated his days to the presence of God, began to engage in political alliances that came with marriages to foreign women. In all, he had hundreds of wives and concubines, many of them from people who worshipped other gods. And little by little, Solomon's heart began to be inclined, not out of ignorance, but out of tolerance, a tolerance that led him to build altars to pagan idols right there in Jerusalem, the city of the living God. These altars were not just physical structures. They were visible signs that Solomon was losing the center that had sustained his reign. The man who had asked for wisdom to rule justly now found himself giving in to vanity, luxury, and the influence of those who did not know God. He did not abandon the worship of the Lord entirely, but he tried to reconcile two worlds, which God found unacceptable. Solomon's divided heart became his greatest weakness, and the spiritual decline that had begun quietly soon spread like a shadow over everything he had built. The Bible records that this disobedience provoked God's wrath. The Lord, who had revealed himself personally to Solomon twice, now announced that the kingdom would not remain intact. The luster of the reign began to fade. What was supposed to be eternal began to fragment. Solomon still reigned gloriously in human eyes, but spiritually he was no longer the same. His decline was not sudden, it was slow, but real. A painful reminder that even the greatest wisdom in the world cannot sustain a heart that turns away from God. The warning came as a direct blow to Solomon's pride. God sent the king a clear and harsh word. Because of his unfaithfulness, the kingdom of Israel would be divided. The sentence would not be carried out while he was alive, for the love of David, his father, but after his death, the consequences would fall upon his son and successor. It was at this moment that the name of Jeroboam came up, a servant of Solomon who, by divine direction, would be raised to rule 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel. What Solomon feared most, the loss of the unity of the people, was sealed. The prophecy came through the prophet Ahijah, who found Jeroboam in the field and tore a garment into 12 pieces, giving him 10 as a sign of what was to come. Solomon learned of the prophecy and, in desperation, tried to kill Jeroboam, who fled to Egypt. The king, who had once been the image of stability, now found himself surrounded by omens and threats from within. His glory was beginning to crumble, not at the hands of foreign armies, but because of the choices he himself had made. This turning point in history was not just political, it was spiritual. God was showing that no throne, no matter how majestic, could survive without faithfulness. The division of the kingdom would be the most profound turning point in Israel's history, and it all began there, with the corrupt heart of a king who had started out so well. The warning was clear, judgment was coming, and the stability so many had admired was numbered. Solomon's once steadfast house was about to face the weight of its own cracks. As an old man, surrounded by everything the world had to offer, gold, servants, women, conquests and fame, Solomon began to see the emptiness that all that concealed. It was only with the weight of years and consequences that he realized how far he had strayed from his original purpose. The brilliance that had once illuminated the kingdom now seemed dull, and it was in this time of silence and reflection that one of the most sincere works in the Bible was born, the book of Ecclesiastes. An almost confessional text, in which Solomon, with all the marks of time, admits, all is vanity. There was no longer a triumphant king trying to impress. He was a man who was broken inside, trying to leave a warning for those who came after him. In his words, Solomon vents about the illusions of pleasure, riches, and prestige. He speaks as if he had tried everything and realized that none of them fills his heart. Instead of giving instructions on government or advice on strategy, he talks about the boredom of existence without God, about how the search for meaning outside the Creator is always frustrated, no matter how pleasurable it may seem at first. Ecclesiastes is not a book to impress, but to awaken. And in that awakening, Solomon closes his account with a teaching that carries repentance and wisdom at the same time. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. The once wisest man in the world now understood that all wisdom without the fear of God is empty noise. And so he tries to leave a legacy that is more profound than any palace or temple. A reminder that the true treasure lies in obedience and intimacy. With God, Solomon died after 40 years of reign. His name still carried respect, but the truth is that he left behind a kingdom in disarray. The visible splendor could not hide the internal cracks that grew year after year. When his son Rehoboam assumed the throne, instability was already evident. The tribes were restless, taxes were heavy, and the people no longer viewed the palace with the same enchantment. Solomon's glory had left behind great legacies, but also deep wounds. Rehoboam did not inherit his father's wisdom. On the contrary, his insensitivity to the people's complaints only hastened the split. The division that God had prophesied happened almost immediately. 10 tribes rebelled and crowned Jeroboam king of the northern kingdom. Rehoboam was left with only Judah and Benjamin. The empire that Solomon had ruled so magnificently was now divided, and the unity of Israel, which had been so laboriously built since the days of David, seemed like a distant dream. Solomon's death marked the end of an era. What began with hope and promise ended in fragmentation and mourning. His legacy came to be viewed with mixed eyes, admiration for his wisdom, but also sadness for his decline. Israel would never be the same again. Solomon's story became a symbol of how God's blessing can be wasted when the heart turns away from him. The golden throne lost its luster, and the peace that his name carried was no longer present among the people. Among the stories that have survived through the centuries, there is one that is not in the canonical scriptures, but that has gained strength in popular tradition and apocryphal texts, the legend of Solomon's ring. According to these stories, God, or the archangel Michael himself, gave him a ring with supernatural powers. With this ring, Solomon would have the authority to command spirits and demons, forcing them to work for the kingdom of God. They say that many of the impressive details of the Temple of Jerusalem were carried out by these beings under his control. This narrative, despite its mystical nature, helps us understand how Solomon's image transcended time. He was not only seen as a wise king, but as someone with access to spiritual dimensions that most people did not even understand. In Jewish, Islamic, and even occult traditions, Solomon's name carries a mystical weight. The ring would be a symbol of his spiritual mastery and his wisdom beyond the natural. Even though it is a legend, it reveals something about the admiration, almost reverence, that many people had for him. This story of the ring also raises reflections. It is as if the world wants to believe that someone like Solomon needed something more to explain such wisdom, a magical object, a special gift. But perhaps Solomon's true ring was his intimacy with God in the first years of his reign, which, over time, he lost. And in the end, what remained were not the powers, but the lesson, that the connection with God is worth more than any mystical instrument, a teaching that echoes to this day, even among those who are enchanted by legends. Solomon's story is both a portrait of the glory that comes from God and a warning about what happens when we turn away from him. He was the wisest man who ever lived, chosen and blessed, used powerfully to accomplish great things. But he was also someone who, despite all this divine favor, allowed himself to be led astray by wrong choices. And at the end of his life, all that was left was regret and the knowledge that without God everything is vanity. This leads us to a direct question: what is the point of having everything if our hearts are far from the Lord? How many times do we put our strength into fleeting achievements, fame and recognition, and forget what really matters? Solomon's story confronts us with this truth and invites us to review our priorities while there is still time. What about you? At what point in your life did you realize that something was missing, even when everything seemed fine on the outside? Share it with us in the comments. Your story could touch other lives. If this message spoke to you in any way, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell, because every week we post content like this, which helps you awaken, reflect, and reconnect with God. Don't put it off. What God wants to say to you may be in the next video, and if you enjoyed this journey through Solomon's life, I invite you to watch other videos on this channel, especially the stories of David, Elijah, and the women who marked the Bible. There are many profound and revealing things waiting for you. May God bless you, and see you in the next video.